Well, I'm delighted to be able to announce at last the publication of my forthcoming book, The Matter with Things, subtitled Our Brains, Our Delusions and the Unmaking of the World. Obviously, the title, The Matter with Things, contains a couple of puns referring to our current, in my view, disastrous world picture. It will be published on the 9th of November by Perspectiva Press in London. But you can pre-order your copy now on Channel McGilchrist or on Perspectiva's own website. There are a couple of advantages to doing that. You get a discount, and you also stand a good chance of getting the book ahead of its official publication date. It's a long book, I admit, and I thought I was through with writing long books. One thing I can guarantee is that I will never write a long book again. It's been a very interesting experience writing this book. It's almost as though the book took over me and my life and demanded to be written. And it's been a long process, roughly 10 years. It's in 2 volumes, which are sold together because it's effectively one argument or one project, and in it I try to convey a whole way of looking at, or better, being in the world. As readers of The Master and His Emissary will know, I believe that our vision has been hijacked by a brain system that evolved merely in order to help us manipulate the world, not to understand it. And in doing so, it has blinded us to a profound and beautiful reality, which is there for all to see if we just open our eyes. We face, I need hardly say, horrendous practical challenges, the terrible despoliation of the natural world, the devastation of the way of life of indigenous peoples all round the globe, and in an act of supreme folly, our rapid engagement in actively destroying all that is good about our civilization and hastening it into barbarism. If there is one thing that is even more important than all these, it is the worldview that underlies each and every one of them. And that's because, as the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead said, as we think, we live. We've come to think of ourselves and the world something like this. The world is essentially inert and mechanical. We more or less understand how that works. And it's nothing but a collection of things for us to use. And we ourselves are nothing but the playthings of chance, embroiled in a war of all against all. Well, what a vision to live down to. Importantly, this is absolutely not a conclusion compelled on us by science or reason, as I demonstrate. But worse, it's intellectually, morally, and spiritually bankrupt, and leads directly to the crisis that we now face. My point is that even if we could survive these crises, it would be pointless without a new understanding of ourselves and the world, because we'd just be as miserable, spiritually impoverished and irresponsible as we now appear to be. And so it's the aim of this book simply to open our eyes to what, at some level, I suspect the reader knows intuitively to be there, but can no longer see. To give you some brief overview of the book, it, as I say, comes in 2 volumes, and in volume 1, called The Ways to Truth, I look at how we get an idea of what reality is at all. What is the best way to search in order to come up with something that we would call at least truer than its alternatives? Because I'm certainly not suggesting, still more am I not suggesting that I am in possession of a single simple truth. Truth is not like that. But we can't afford to do away with the concept, because everything we say, everything we do, depends on the idea that some things are truer than others. So how do we attempt this? And what I suggest is that there are 6 or 7 faculties that we have, if you like, which we bring to bear on reality. And they would be attention, which, as I've often said, actually forms the basis of the reality that we find when we look at the world. Perception, which is not the same as attention. And the judgments we form on the basis of attention and perception. Those judgments, in turn, being informed by our emotional and social intelligence and our cognitive intelligence, IQ in other words, and our capacity for creativity. These are the ways in which we can, as it were, get hold of something that is part of the other that we encounter as living human beings. And in brief, I can show that in each case the right hemisphere is more veridical than the left, and indeed that if we rely largely on the left hemisphere, we're soon into the territory of literal delusions and hallucinations. I do in fact paint a picture of what it is like to be a subject who has effectively a non-functioning right hemisphere, and I think that the reader will be amazed and somewhat appalled at how close this picture is to the one that we find in the world around us nowadays, at least in the so-called developed world. That may surprise you, that one hemisphere will be much, much better than the other at so many things. There's got to be a trade-off, and indeed there is, and I argue that the left hemisphere no longer has the task of putting us in touch with reality, but instead in mapping it, creating a theory about it, doing some virtual manipulations on it that will enable us to outwit other human beings or grasp things readily. So in a way, over evolution, it's lost that faculty in comparison with the right hemisphere, which is very much better at showing us the complexity of reality with all its nuances, not a kind of very simplified diagram of the world in which we now somehow are coming to believe that we actually live. Hence the most extraordinary things that nowadays we believe, and that every 10 years goes by, the things we believe seem to be more and more out of touch with any kind of reality that you or I might experience. In the second part of that volume, Volume 1, I look at effectively the 4 paths, rather than just the faculties, that we would use to arrive at what we could fairly reasonably call truth. And I take those to be science, reason, intuition, and imagination. And I think that probably everyone will agree with me about science and reason. A lot of people will agree with me about intuition and imagination, but not everyone. But I spend several chapters on each of these, looking at what they're good at and what their limitations are. And the long and short of that is that we need each and every one of these in almost all cases where they're appropriate. We certainly need more than 1 or 2, which at the moment it seems to me is all we bring to bear on debates about big questions. And there again, in science and reason, just as much as in intuition and imagination, I show that the right hemisphere provides the most important part. That might surprise many people about science, for example, and too often people think that I've got something to say like, the right hemisphere is emotional and the left hemisphere is unemotional but sort of rationalistic and so on. And it's just not as simple as that at all. The left hemisphere is often quite wild and out of touch and very angry and emotional, and also is not more insightful than the right hemisphere. In fact, if you look at the stories of the great scientists and mathematicians about how they reached their conclusions, and I go into that quite a lot in the book. You hear the most wonderful stories about how in those spheres that we think of as so routine, in fact, the discoveries were made by a whole human being using all his or her faculties. So once again, the right hemisphere seems to be the more veridical. And that's volume 1. And then volume 2 is really the purpose of volume 1. What can we do when we've seen how in touch or out of touch these two ways of looking at the world are? We can now recognize the imprint, the hallmark, the characteristic style of the left and the right hemisphere, because we'd have seen so much of that in volume 1. And we can therefore, at last, add to what generally happens in philosophy, is that there are paradoxical findings which keep people arguing merrily for centuries and millennia. And I'm not saying that, of course, I can resolve them. But what I can do is shine a new light on them, because very often these paradoxes can be traced to the characteristic way of thinking of the left hemisphere and the characteristic way of thinking of the right hemisphere. And these paradoxes usually surround fairly basic things. When I say basic, I mean really fundamentally important, not simple in the sense that basic means simple, but no, profound, all-important, like time, space, consciousness, matter, value, purpose, and the sense of the sacred. These things are pretty much irreducible and extremely important to all of us if we're going to understand our relation to the cosmos at large. And I also look at the structure of that cosmos and show that, in fact, opposites, far from excluding one another, very often coexist and must coexist. And blindness to that coexistence can, in fact, be dangerous. It's rather like the two polar ends of a magnet. You can't just have the North Pole. Even if you cut off the South Pole, you just create a new South Pole on a shorter magnet. Nor, like the North and South Pole, am I suggesting that there's a hard and fast barrier between them, because there clearly isn't, as there isn't in the magnet. But it is an important insight, and it relates to the other very important insight when we're looking at nature, that the relationship between one and many, or the one and the many in most traditions of philosophy around the world, is a very, very important question, as it is for all of us. How does the uniqueness of everything we experience relate to the capacity we have to see it as an exemplar of a certain kind of general thing? And what are the values and the problems that can emerge if we don't understand that? So I'm afraid it is pretty much an attempt to give an overall philosophy of life and where we stand in the cosmos. And instead of thinking of us as these fragmented, atomistic individuals simply striving for power and ascendancy in a world that has no intrinsic meaning or purpose, and in which we find and paint onto it the things that we find beautiful and good, which are really just things that we plaster on the walls of our prison cell to make the imprisonment more tolerable. Quite the opposite. We have created a prison cell for ourselves in which we can hardly see any more things through that narrow window high up on the wall with the bar across it. And I want to bring us back to a vision which I believe is very important. It's one that brings the world back to life and brings us the chance to live a better life within it. I think that if we're able to take on board the fundamental idea that I'm not surely alone in putting forward, but that I'm striving to make a good case for, if we can take that on, then we will not only be able, perhaps, to reverse the crises we find ourselves in and survive, but to be worthy of survival. If we don't, we'll simply be repeating history in a catastrophic way. Thank you.